The carriage jolted hard as it struck a rock on the frozen road, and Elena Whitmore gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding faster than the horses outside. She was not afraid of the cold, or the long journey, or even the strange castle waiting for her at the end of it. She was afraid of the man she was about to marry. Duke Alastair Ravensworth had a reputation that traveled faster than any letter. People whispered that he had thrown a guest out of his own home for arriving late. They said he had once made a merchant kneel in the snow for overcharging him. They said his eyes were as cold as the stone walls of his estate, and that no one who worked for him stayed longer than a year before fleeing in fear or exhaustion. Elena had heard all of this from her mother, who delivered the news of the arranged marriage with trembling hands and a forced smile. "It is settled, my dear," her mother had said. "Your father owes a debt to the Ravensworth family, one that cannot be repaid in money. The only way to save our house from ruin is this marriage." Elena had wanted to scream. She had wanted to run from the room and refuse to ever return. But she had seen her father's face, pale and sunken with worry, and she had seen the empty shelves in their pantry, and she understood there was no other way. So now she sat in a carriage rattling toward a man who despised the very idea of her, toward a life she had never chosen, toward a future that felt more like punishment than marriage. The castle came into view just as the sun began to sink behind the hills, throwing long shadows across the frozen fields. It was enormous, built of gray stone that seemed to swallow the last light of day. Towers rose into the darkening sky like fingers reaching toward the clouds. Elena felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the weather. The carriage stopped in the courtyard, and a servant hurried to open the door. Elena stepped down, smoothing her traveling dress, trying to steady her breathing. She looked up at the massive doors of the castle and saw a figure standing there, tall and still, watching her with an expression she could not read. Duke Alastair Ravensworth was younger than she expected, though his face carried the weight of someone who had lived through far more than his years suggested. His dark hair was pushed back from his forehead, and his jaw was set in a hard line. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, studied her with something close to contempt. "You are late," he said, his voice sharp and cold. Elena's chin lifted. "The roads were difficult, Your Grace." "Everything is difficult when people do not plan properly." He turned without another word and walked back into the castle, leaving her standing in the courtyard with her trunk and her fear. A servant, an older woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled into a tight bun, hurried forward to help Elena inside. "Do not mind him, my lady," the woman whispered. "The Duke is not easy, but you will manage. My name is Margaret. I have served this house for many years." Elena managed a small smile, grateful for the one warm face in the cold castle. "Thank you, Margaret. I fear I will need all the guidance I can get." Inside, the castle was even grander and colder than it appeared from outside. High ceilings stretched above them, decorated with old paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The stone floors echoed with every footstep. Elena felt very small as she followed Margaret through the long hallways, past closed doors and silent rooms. "The wedding will take place tomorrow morning," Margaret said quietly. "The Duke wishes it to be simple, no large gathering. He says there is no reason to celebrate an arrangement made out of necessity." The words stung more than Elena expected, though she tried not to show it. She had known this marriage was not born of love. She had known the Duke saw her as nothing more than a solution to a political debt, but hearing it spoken so plainly still felt like a blow. "I understand," she said simply. Margaret led her to a room in a distant wing of the castle, far from what she explained was the Duke's own chambers. The room was plain but clean, with a large window overlooking a frozen garden below. "This will be your room, my lady. If you need anything, ring the bell by the door." When Margaret left, Elena sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself a moment of quiet grief. She thought of her family's modest home, of her mother's worried eyes, of her father's shame. She thought of the years ahead of her, married to a man who had not even offered her a proper greeting. But as she sat there in the fading light, something inside her hardened into resolve. She had not chosen this marriage, but she would not enter it as a frightened girl waiting to be dismissed. She would not let this cold castle or its colder master break her spirit. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, matching the mood of the entire castle. Elena dressed in a simple ivory gown that Margaret had prepared for her, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the small buttons along the sleeves. She looked at her reflection in the tall mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked pale, tired, and uncertain, but she straightened her shoulders and told herself that whatever happened today, she would face it with dignity. The ceremony took place in a small chapel within the castle grounds, attended by only a handful of witnesses. No family members were present from either side except a distant cousin of the Duke, an elderly man who seemed more interested in the cold weather than the wedding itself. The priest spoke the vows in a hurried, businesslike tone, as if he too understood this was not a joyous occasion but a necessary transaction. Alistair stood beside her throughout the ceremony, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder rather than on her face. When it came time to exchange rings, his fingers brushed against hers only briefly, and she felt no warmth in the touch, only the cold metal of the ring sliding onto her finger. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alistair did not smile. He did not reach for her hand. He simply turned and walked out of the chapel, leaving Alina standing alone at the altar with the small gathering of witnesses watching in awkward silence. Margaret hurried to her side, offering a comforting pat on the arm. "Come, my lady, let us get you something warm to eat." Alina nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and followed Margaret out of the chapel. As they crossed the courtyard, she caught sight of Alistair standing near the stables, speaking sharply to a young stable hand who looked terrified. She could not hear the words, but she saw the boy flinch and hurry away, and she saw the cold satisfaction on Alistair's face as he watched him go. This was the man she had married, a man who found satisfaction in the fear of others, a man who had not spared her a single kind word since her arrival. Alina felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sudden, cutting through the sadness that had settled over her since the carriage ride. She was not going to spend the rest of her life shrinking in the shadow of this man's cruelty. If he wanted to treat their marriage as nothing more than an unwanted obligation, then she would simply have to prove to him, and to everyone in this castle, that she was not a woman to be dismissed so easily. That evening she was given dinner alone in her room, a tray of food brought by a young maid who barely made eye contact with her. Alina asked the girl her name. "Lucy, my lady," the maid answered, startled by the question. "Thank you, Lucy, this looks wonderful." Alina offered a genuine smile, and the girl seemed surprised by the kindness, as if she had expected Alina to behave like the cold nobility she had likely grown used to serving. "Is the Duke always so distant?" Alina asked carefully, not wanting to pry too much but genuinely curious. Lucy hesitated, glancing toward the door as if worried someone might overhear. "He was not always this way, my lady. Before I came to work here, the older servants say he was different, kinder, but something happened years ago and he has not been the same since." "What happened?" Alina asked gently. Lucy shook her head quickly. "It is not my place to say, my lady. Please forgive me." She curtsied and hurried from the room, leaving Alina alone with her thoughts and her uneaten dinner. Alina sat by the window that night, looking out over the dark castle grounds, wondering what secret lay buried beneath the Duke's icy exterior. She thought about what Lucy had said, that he had not always been this way. Something had changed him. Someone had hurt him deeply enough to turn a kind man into someone who found comfort in cruelty. She did not know yet what that secret was, but she felt with a strange and unexpected certainty that she would find out. And more than that, she felt a quiet determination settling into her heart. She had not asked for this marriage. She had not asked to be sent away from her family to live among strangers in a cold castle with a colder husband. But she was here now, and she would not simply survive this life. She would find a way to make it hers. The wind rattled against the window, and somewhere deep in the castle, she heard the faint sound of a door closing. She wondered if it was Alistair, retreating to whatever dark memories haunted him each night. She felt, despite everything, a small flicker of curiosity where fear had been. Whatever had made him this way, whatever pain lived behind those cold gray eyes, Alina decided that she would not let it define how she lived in this house. Tomorrow she would begin to understand this strange new world she had been thrown into. Tomorrow she would begin to find her place within it, whether the Duke wanted her there or not. As she finally climbed into the unfamiliar bed and pulled the heavy blankets around her shoulders, she allowed herself one final thought before sleep took her. Somewhere beneath his coldness, there had once been warmth, and if there had been warmth before, perhaps it was not entirely gone. Perhaps it was simply waiting for someone brave enough to find it again. The days that followed her wedding tested every ounce of patience Alina possessed. She woke each morning to a castle that felt more like a fortress than a home, its halls silent except for the occasional murmur of servants moving quickly and quietly, as though loud footsteps might summon the Duke's displeasure. She rarely saw Alistair at all. He took his meals alone in his study, conducted his business behind closed doors, and when their paths did cross in a hallway or courtyard, he offered nothing more than a curt nod before continuing on his way. At first, Elena told herself this distance was for the best. She needed time to understand this new world, to learn the rhythms of the household, to find her footing without the added weight of her husband's cold stares. But as the days stretched into a week, and the week began to stretch toward a month, she realized that his absence was not simply distance. It was a message. He wanted her to understand, clearly and without doubt, that she was not welcome in his life beyond the paper that bound their names together. She refused to let that message defeat her. Instead, Elena began to explore the castle on her own, learning its many rooms and corridors, meeting the servants who worked tirelessly to keep the enormous estate running. She learned the name of every maid, every stable hand, every gardener who tended the frozen grounds. She listened to their small complaints, noticed when supplies were running low, and began quietly making decisions to improve their daily lives, even when no one had asked her to. Margaret became her closest ally in these early weeks, guiding her through the unspoken rules of the household and warning her gently about the moods of the Duke. "He does not like surprises," Margaret told her one afternoon as they walked through the kitchen gardens, "and he does not like being questioned." "I am not trying to provoke him," Elena replied. "I simply want to understand this place. Is that so wrong?" Margaret's expression softened. "No, my lady, it is not wrong at all. It is simply unfamiliar to him. No one has shown this much interest in the estate, or its people, in a very long time." Elena took those words to heart, and she continued her quiet work throughout the castle, even as she remained mostly invisible to her husband. It was during one of these explorations that she discovered a problem in the estate's finances, one that seemed to have gone unnoticed for months. While reviewing old ledgers left carelessly in an unused study, she found that the steward responsible for managing the household accounts had been overpaying several merchants for goods that could easily be purchased elsewhere at a fraction of the cost. The mismanagement was significant enough that it had been slowly draining resources from an already strained estate. At first, Elena considered saying nothing. It was not her place, after all, to interfere in matters of the household finances, especially when her husband had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her beyond the necessity of their marriage. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that silence would not serve the estate or the people who depended on it for their livelihoods. She summoned the steward, a nervous man named Edmund, and calmly presented her findings. "My lady," Edmund stammered, clearly startled that the new Duchess had taken such an interest in matters he assumed were beyond her concern. "These arrangements were made under the previous steward before my time. I have simply continued the existing contracts." "Then it is time we changed them," Elena said firmly. "There is no reason the estate should be paying triple the fair price for grain when there are merchants in the nearby village offering better quality for far less." Edmund hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door, as if expecting the Duke to appear at any moment and demand an explanation for this unauthorized decision. "My lady, I am not certain His Grace would approve of such changes without his direct instruction." "Then I will take responsibility for the decision," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "The estate cannot continue bleeding money over old arrangements that no longer serve its interests. Renegotiate the contracts, Edmund. I trust you can handle the details." Edmund left the room looking both relieved and terrified, and Elena sat back in her chair, wondering if she had just made a grave mistake. She had acted without her husband's knowledge, without his permission, in a matter that was traditionally his alone to decide. But as she thought of the servants who worked so hard for so little, and the resources that had been wasted while the estate quietly struggled, she felt no regret for her decision. It did not take long for word of the change to reach Alistair. 3 days later, as Elena sat in the small library reading by the fire, the door burst open with such force that she nearly dropped her book. Alistair stood in the doorway, his face dark with anger, a stack of papers clutched in his hand. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, striding into the room and dropping the papers onto the table beside her. "You changed the merchant contracts without my knowledge." Elena set down her book carefully, her heart pounding but her expression calm. "I did." "You had no right," Alistair snapped, his voice rising with a fury she had not yet seen directed at her. "These decisions are not yours to make. You are new to this household. You know nothing of how it operates. I know that the estate was losing a significant amount of money each month due to poor contracts that no one had bothered to review in years," Elena replied evenly, refusing to let his anger shake her composure. "I know that the servants who work here deserve better wages, which could easily be provided if the estate were not wasting resources on overpriced goods. And I know that no one, including you, seemed to notice this problem until I brought it to light." Alistair's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought he might explode with rage. Instead, he stared at her, something flickering behind his cold eyes that she could not quite identify. "You had no right to act without consulting me," he said again, though his voice had lost some of its earlier heat. "I attempted to consider the matter carefully before acting," Elena replied. "But you have made it very clear, Your Grace, that you have no interest in speaking with me about anything, let alone the management of this household. I did what I believed was best for the people who depend on this estate. If that displeases you, I am sorry, but I am not sorry for the decision itself." Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Alistair looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, rather than simply the obligation she represented. Elena held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to shrink beneath his anger the way she suspected everyone else in this household did. Finally, Alistair picked up the papers from the table, his movements stiff. "The numbers appear accurate," he admitted grudgingly, his eyes scanning the figures Elena had prepared. "I had not realized the extent of the mismanagement." "Then perhaps," Elena said carefully, sensing an opening in his defenses, "it would be wise for us to review the household finances together, rather than separately. I do not wish to overstep, Your Grace. I only wish to help this estate thrive, as I imagine you do as well." Alistair studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are unlike any woman I have met," he said finally, though his tone carried no warmth, only a kind of wary curiosity. "I hope that is not entirely unwelcome," Elena replied, allowing a small smile to touch her lips. Alistair did not smile in return, but something in his posture softened just slightly. "We will discuss the finances tomorrow, properly." "In my study," he turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Do not act without my knowledge again." "I will not act without informing you," Elena replied carefully, "provided you are willing to listen when I do." Alistair did not respond, but he did not argue either. He simply left the room, leaving Elena alone with her racing heart and the strange, unfamiliar feeling that perhaps, for the first time since her arrival, she had made the Duke truly notice her. That night, as she prepared for bed, Elena allowed herself to feel a small sense of victory. She had not backed down. She had not apologized for using her intelligence and her care for the people around her, even when it meant confronting a man everyone else feared. It was a small step, she knew, in what would likely be a long and difficult journey, but it was a step forward nonetheless. She thought of Lucy's words from weeks earlier, about the man Alistair used to be before something changed him. She wondered again what secret lay behind his cold exterior, what pain had hardened his heart so completely. She did not know the answer yet, but she found herself wanting to know, wanting to understand the man she had been forced to marry, rather than simply enduring her fate beside him. As she drifted toward sleep, she made herself a quiet promise. She would not force her way into his heart, nor would she beg for his affection. But she would continue to be herself, unafraid and unwavering, and if there was any warmth left beneath his coldness, she would give him the space and the patience to find it again in his own time. Outside her window, the castle stood silent beneath the winter sky, its ancient stones holding secrets that neither of them had yet spoken aloud. But for the first time since her arrival, Elena felt a small flicker of hope that this marriage, however it had begun, might not remain forever cold. The following morning, Elena arrived at the study exactly on time, dressed simply, her hair pulled back neatly, a leather folder of notes tucked under her arm. She had spent half the night preparing, reviewing the numbers again and again, determined not to appear before Alistair as anything less than capable. Whatever he thought of her, she would not give him reason to dismiss her insight as foolish or uninformed. The study was a large room lined with tall bookshelves, a fireplace crackling at one end, and a heavy wooden desk near the window where Alistair already sat, papers spread before him. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable, and gestured toward the chair across from him. "You are punctual," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I try to be," Alina replied, taking her seat and opening her folder. "Shall we begin?" For the next 2 hours, they worked through the estate's finances together, Alina presenting her findings with clear, measured explanations, Alistair questioning every figure with sharp, probing intensity. She had expected him to dismiss her ideas outright, to insist on his own judgment regardless of the evidence before him. Instead, she found a man who, despite his coldness, respected competence when he saw it. He challenged her, yes, but he also listened, and slowly, grudgingly, he began to agree with several of her proposals. "The grain contracts should be renegotiated by the end of the month," he said finally, making a note in the margin of one of the pages. "And the wool merchant in the village, the one you mentioned, arrange a meeting with him directly." "I already have," Alina said quietly. Alistair looked up, something almost like amusement flickering across his face, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Of course you have." It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had received from him since her arrival, and Alina found herself holding onto it with more hope than she cared to admit. Over the following weeks, these meetings became a regular occurrence, though Alistair never spoke of them as anything more than necessary business. Alina did not push him toward friendliness, understanding instinctively that any attempt to force warmth from him would only cause him to retreat further behind his walls. Instead, she simply continued being herself, competent and steady, patient in the face of his sharp words, unafraid to disagree with him when she believed she was right. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the household began to change. The servants, who had once moved through the halls in fearful silence, began to relax slightly, sensing that the new Duchess brought a measure of fairness and stability that had been missing for a long time. Wages were adjusted. Broken equipment was repaired instead of ignored. Complaints, once buried out of fear of the Duke's temper, found their way to Alina instead, and she addressed them with quiet efficiency, often without ever needing to involve Alistair directly. But not everyone welcomed these changes. One afternoon, as Alina walked through the eastern hallway, she overheard raised voices coming from behind a partially closed door. She recognized Alistair's voice immediately, sharp and controlled, but the second voice was unfamiliar, older and dripping with false politeness. "You cannot simply ignore the family's claim, Alistair," the unfamiliar voice said. "Your father made promises before his death, promises regarding the northern lands. I have every right to see them honored." "My father made many promises he had no business making," Alistair replied coldly. "The northern lands belong to this estate, and they will remain so as long as I hold this title. A title you nearly lost, if I recall, when your own judgment failed you so completely." The voice carried a cruel edge now, one clearly meant to wound. "Perhaps if you had chosen your first bride more wisely, none of this would be necessary." There was a long, heavy silence, and Alina felt her chest tighten, sensing she had stumbled upon something significant, something connected to the pain Lucy had hinted at weeks earlier. "Leave my study," Alistair said finally, his voice low and dangerous, "before I have you removed from this estate entirely." The door opened suddenly, and a man Alina did not recognize stepped out, his expression twisted with irritation. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, dressed in fine but slightly worn clothing that suggested a nobleman whose fortune had seen better days. His eyes landed on Alina, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Ah, the new Duchess," he said, his tone dripping with false charm. "I had heard rumors of your arrival. I am Lord Cedric Hargrove, a distant relative of your husband. I do hope you are prepared for the difficulties of this family. We have quite a complicated history." Alina kept her expression carefully neutral, though her curiosity burned fiercely beneath the surface. "I am certain every family has its complications, Lord Hargrove." Cedric's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "Indeed, though few families have a history quite as tragic as this one, I do hope for your sake that you fare better than his first fiancée." Before Alina could respond, Alistair appeared in the doorway, his face like thunder. "That is enough, Cedric, leave now." Cedric offered a mocking bow before departing down the hallway, leaving a heavy, uncomfortable silence in his wake. Alina looked toward Alistair, hoping for some explanation, but his expression had closed off completely, retreating behind the same cold mask he had worn since her arrival. "You should not concern yourself with him," Alastair said stiffly. "He is nothing but a bitter old man seeking to stir trouble where none exists." "He mentioned a fiancée," Alina said carefully, unwilling to let the moment pass without at least attempting to understand. Alastair's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alina thought he might simply walk away without answering, as he had done so many times before. But something in his expression shifted, a flicker of old pain breaking briefly through his carefully maintained composure. "That is not a conversation for today," he said quietly, before turning and disappearing back into his study, closing the door firmly behind him. Alina stood alone in the hallway, her mind racing with questions. Whatever had happened with this mysterious former fiancé, it was clearly the source of the pain that had transformed Alastair into the cold, guarded man he had become. She thought of Cedric's cruel words, his mention of tragedy, his implication that Alastair's judgment had failed him once before in matters of the heart. She did not press the matter further that day, sensing that pushing too hard would only cause Alastair to retreat further behind his walls. Instead, she returned to her own quarters, her thoughts heavy with unanswered questions and a growing, unexpected sympathy for the man she had married. It was Margaret, several days later, who finally offered Alina the answers she sought, though the older woman clearly did so with great reluctance. "It is not my place to speak of it, my lady," Margaret said as they sat together in the small sitting room, mending linens by the fire. "But I fear you deserve to understand the man you have married, even if he himself will not tell you." "Please," Alina said gently, "I only wish to understand him, not to judge him." Margaret sighed, setting down her needle. "5 years ago, before you arrived, the Duke was engaged to a young woman named Charlotte, the daughter of a respected family from the southern counties. He loved her deeply, my lady. I have never seen a man so devoted to another person. He changed the entire estate to prepare for their marriage, planned celebrations, wrote to her every single day when she traveled." Alina listened quietly, sensing the weight of the story yet to come. "But 3 weeks before their wedding," Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower, "Charlotte disappeared with his own younger brother, Edward. They fled together, leaving behind nothing but a letter explaining that they had fallen in love and could not bear to live a lie any longer. The Duke was devastated, humiliated before the entire nobility. His own brother, the person he trusted most in this world, had betrayed him in the cruelest way imaginable." Alina felt her chest tighten with sympathy, understanding now the depth of the wound that had hardened Alastair's heart. "He was never the same after that," Margaret said quietly. "He closed himself off from everyone, convinced that trust and love only lead to betrayal and pain. He threw himself entirely into managing the estate, into maintaining strict control over everything and everyone around him, as if control could somehow protect him from being hurt again." "And his brother?" Alina asked softly. "Edward and Charlotte married quietly in another county," Margaret said. "The Duke has not spoken his brother's name since. As far as this household is concerned, Edward Ravensworth no longer exists." Alina sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this painful history, feeling a deep and unexpected ache in her heart for the man she had married. She understood now why he had greeted their forced marriage with such contempt, why he had built such high walls around himself, why he trusted no one and expected betrayal from everyone he encountered. She also understood, with sudden clarity, why Lord Cedric's cruel words had struck so deeply. He had reopened a wound that had never truly healed, one that Alastair carried silently beneath his cold exterior every single day. That night Alina could not sleep, her mind replaying everything Margaret had told her. She thought of the young man Alastair must have once been, full of love and devotion, only to have that love thrown back in his face in the most humiliating way possible. She thought of the years he had spent since then, alone in this vast cold castle, convinced that warmth and trust were luxuries he could no longer afford. She rose from her bed and walked to her window, looking out over the moonlit grounds. In the distance, she noticed a faint light coming from what she recognized as Alastair's study, still burning despite the late hour. She wondered if he too was awake, haunted by memories he could never quite escape. Without fully deciding to do so, Alina found herself dressing quickly and making her way through the quiet, dark hallways toward his study. She told herself she simply wanted to check that he was well, though a part of her recognized a deeper pull, an instinct to reach toward the pain she now understood lived within him. She knocked softly on the study door, and after a long pause, Alistair's voice called out, rough with fatigue, "Enter." She found him seated at his desk, a glass of untouched wine before him, his eyes distant and tired. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering across his face before it settled back into cautious neutrality. "It is late," he said. "You should be resting." "So should you," Alina replied gently, stepping further into the room. Alistair did not respond, his gaze dropping to the papers before him, though Alina suspected he was not truly reading them at all. "I know about Charlotte," she said quietly. "And Edward." His entire body went still, and for a long moment she thought he might order her to leave, might retreat completely behind his walls as he always did whenever the conversation touched anything personal. But instead, he simply exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, as if the weight of a long-carried secret had finally found release. "Margaret told you," he said, not a question but a quiet statement. "She did. I asked her too after Lord Hargrove's comments. I hope you are not angry with her." Alistair shook his head slowly. "No, I imagine you would have learned eventually, one way or another. This household holds few secrets for long." Alina moved closer, taking a seat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she had occupied during their finance discussions, though this conversation felt entirely different, far more delicate and uncertain. "I am sorry," she said simply, "for what happened to you. No one deserves that kind of betrayal, especially not from someone they trusted so completely." Alistair's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alina worried she had overstepped. But then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he began to speak. "I loved her," he said, his voice rough with old pain. "I trusted my brother more than I trusted anyone else in this world. And they took that trust and destroyed it without a second thought, without any concern for how it would affect me or this family or anything beyond their own desires." He paused, staring into the fire. "I swore after that I would never again allow myself to be so vulnerable. I would never again give someone that kind of power over me." "And so you built walls," Alina said softly, "and pushed everyone away before they had the chance to hurt you." Alistair looked at her then, something raw and unguarded flickering in his grey eyes. "Yes. I cannot promise you that trust will never lead to pain again," Alina said carefully. "No one can promise that, but I can promise you that I have no interest in betraying you, Alistair. I did not choose this marriage, but I have no desire to add to the pain you already carry." Silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer uncomfortable. Alistair studied her for a long moment, as if searching for some hidden motive behind her words, some sign of the deception he had come to expect from everyone around him. But he found none, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, the smallest crack appearing in the walls he had spent 5 years building. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words clearly unfamiliar and difficult for him to speak, "for your honesty." Alina offered a small, genuine smile. "You are welcome. Now please try to get some rest. The estate will still be here in the morning, and so, I imagine, will its many problems." For the first time since her arrival, Alistair's lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile, brief and fleeting, but real nonetheless. "As will you, it seems." "As will I," Alina agreed, rising from her chair. "Good night, Alistair." "Good night, Alina." As she walked back through the quiet, dark hallways toward her own chambers, Alina felt something shift within her, a fragile new understanding settling between herself and the man she had married. He was not simply cruel, as the rumors had suggested. He was wounded deeply and profoundly, carrying scars from a betrayal that had shattered his ability to trust. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Alina felt, for the first time, a genuine hope that perhaps, together, they might find a way to heal what had been broken. Winter deepened over the following weeks, blanketing the estate in heavy snow that made travel nearly impossible. Confined largely to the castle, Alina and Alistair found themselves crossing paths more frequently, their finance meetings gradually extending into longer conversations about the estate, the tenants, and eventually, though carefully, about themselves. Alina learned that Alistair had taken over the dukedom at a young age, following his father's sudden death, long before Charlotte's betrayal had hardened him further. She learned that beneath his sharp exterior, he genuinely cared for the tenants who depended on the estate, even if he rarely showed it openly. She noticed how he quietly ensured firewood reached the poorer families in the village during the harsh winter months, how he never once complained about the cost, though he never spoke of it either, as if kindness were something to be hidden rather than celebrated. In turn, Alastair began to notice things about Alina that surprised him. She never flattered him, never sought his approval the way so many others in his life had. She disagreed with him openly when she believed he was wrong, yet she never did so cruelly, always offering her reasoning with patience and respect. She treated every member of the household, from the highest steward to the youngest kitchen maid, with the same genuine warmth and consideration. One afternoon, as a fierce snowstorm raged outside, trapping them both indoors, Alastair found Alina in the kitchen, flour dusted across her apron, laughing softly with the cook as they attempted to bake bread together, a task Alina clearly had little experience with. "You are meant to be resting," he said, leaning against the doorway, watching her with an expression that was difficult to name. "I grew restless," Alina admitted, brushing flour from her cheek, leaving a small streak behind that made Alastair's lips twitch with unexpected amusement. "And cook here has been kind enough to teach me, though I fear I am a hopeless student." The cook, an older woman named Beatrice, chuckled warmly. "She has enthusiasm, your grace, if not skill." Alastair found himself stepping further into the kitchen, drawn by a curiosity he did not fully understand. "May I try?" Alina's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "You wish to bake bread?" "I wish to see if I am equally hopeless," Alastair replied, a rare hint of dry humor coloring his voice. What followed was an afternoon unlike any Alina had experienced since her arrival, filled with flour-covered hands, small laughter, and Alastair's surprisingly clumsy attempts at kneading dough. For the first time, she saw glimpses of the man he must have been before Charlotte's betrayal, someone capable of warmth and humor, someone who had simply forgotten how to access those parts of himself. By the time the bread emerged from the oven, slightly misshapen but edible, both Alina and Alastair were laughing genuinely, the sound echoing strangely in a kitchen that had likely not heard such warmth in years. "I believe," Alina said, examining their lopsided creation, "we have discovered a new area in which neither of us excels." "A humbling experience," Alastair agreed, and though his tone remained measured, his eyes held a warmth Alina had not seen there before. These small moments began accumulating over the following weeks, quiet instances of connection that neither of them acknowledged openly but both clearly noticed. Alastair began seeking Alina out beyond their necessary finance discussions, finding reasons to walk with her through the castle gardens, even in the cold, or to join her for evening tea in the small library. Yet despite this growing warmth, Alastair remained guarded in certain ways, careful never to speak too openly of his feelings, as if doing so might invite the same painful betrayal he had suffered once before. Alina understood this hesitation and did not push him faster than he was ready to go, content instead to let their relationship develop naturally, built on patience and mutual respect rather than forced intimacy. It was during this fragile, developing peace that trouble arrived once again, this time in a far more serious form than Lord Cedric's cruel words. A letter arrived one morning, delivered by a messenger who had traveled through dangerous winter roads to reach the estate. Alastair read it in silence, his face growing increasingly pale as he absorbed its contents. Alina, sensing something seriously wrong, waited quietly until he finally looked up, his expression grave. "Lord Hargrove has petitioned the crown," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "claiming that my father's will contained irregularities that call into question the legitimacy of my inheritance. He seeks to have the northern lands, and potentially the entire dukedom, transferred to his own family line." Alina felt a cold wave of shock wash over her. Can he do that? Does he have any legitimate claim? "His claim is weak," Alastair said, though worry clearly lined his features. "But he has connections at court and enough money to make trouble even with a weak claim. If this petition gains traction, it could take months, even years, to resolve. And during that time, the uncertainty alone could destabilize the entire estate, frightening tenants, disrupting trade agreements, damaging everything we have worked to rebuild." Alina's mind raced, already considering possibilities. "What does the petition specifically claim?" Alastair handed her the letter, and she read through it carefully, her sharp mind already identifying weaknesses in Cedric's argument, inconsistencies that might be challenged with the right evidence and the right connections. "My family," she said slowly, "an idea forming, though not wealthy, has long-standing relationships with several members of the court, built through my father's years of service in matters of law. If we could gather clear documentation proving the legitimacy of your father's will, and present it alongside testimony from respected witnesses, we might be able to counter this petition before it gains any real momentum. Alastair looked at her with something between surprise and cautious hope. You would help with this? You are my husband, Elena said simply. Whatever affects this estate affects us both. Of course I will help. Over the following days, Elena threw herself into the effort alongside Alastair, reviewing old legal documents, drafting letters to contacts within her family's network, carefully building a case to counter Lord Cedric's claims. She discovered through careful research that Cedric himself had significant debts that likely motivated his sudden interest in contesting the inheritance after years of silence on the matter. This is not about justice for him, Elena said one evening, spreading documents across Alastair's desk as they worked late into the night. This is about desperation. He needs money, and he believes contesting your inheritance is his easiest path to acquiring it. Alastair studied the documents she had gathered, something like genuine admiration flickering in his grey eyes as he watched her work with such focused determination. You have done more for this estate's defense in a few days than my own lawyers managed in weeks. Your lawyers were not motivated by anything beyond their fee, Elena replied. I am motivated by protecting the people who depend on this estate, and, she added more quietly, by protecting you. Alastair looked up sharply at her words, something shifting in his expression, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. Why? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Why would you fight so hard for a man who greeted your arrival with such coldness? Elena set down the papers in her hands and met his gaze directly. Because that coldness was never truly about me, Alastair. It was about protecting yourself from pain you had already suffered once before. I understood that from the beginning, even before Margaret told me your history. And I have seen over these past weeks the man beneath that coldness. A man who cares deeply for the people around him even when he struggles to show it. That is the man I am fighting for. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotion. Alastair rose slowly from his chair and moved around the desk, standing before her with an expression of quiet wonder, as if he could not quite believe the sincerity in her words. I do not deserve such loyalty, he said softly, not after how I treated you when you first arrived. Perhaps not, Elena admitted honestly, but loyalty is not always about deserving it, Alastair. Sometimes it is about choosing to see someone's true worth, even when they have not yet shown it to themselves. Alastair reached out then, hesitantly, and gently took her hand in his, a gesture so simple yet so significant given his careful avoidance of any physical closeness since their marriage began. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing something in me that I had forgotten existed. Elena felt her heart swell with a warmth she had not expected to feel so soon in this arranged marriage, a warmth that had grown slowly but steadily from the ashes of what had once been nothing more than cold obligation. She squeezed his hand gently in return, offering silent reassurance. We will resolve this together, she said firmly. Lord Hargrove has underestimated us both, and I intend to prove him thoroughly wrong. Over the following weeks, their combined efforts began to bear fruit. Letters arrived from Elena's family contacts, offering testimony and legal support that strengthened their case considerably. Alastair, drawing on his own connections despite his usual reluctance to ask for help, secured additional evidence proving the legitimacy of his father's original will, along with documentation exposing Cedric's significant financial troubles that painted his petition as an act of desperation rather than genuine justice. Throughout this challenging period, Elena and Alastair grew closer than either had anticipated, their shared purpose creating a bond built on genuine partnership rather than forced obligation. Alastair found himself sharing more of his thoughts and worries with Elena than he had shared with anyone since Charlotte's betrayal, while Elena found herself falling, slowly and carefully, for the complicated, wounded man beneath the Duke's cold exterior. Yet even as their bond deepened, uncertainty remained. Lord Cedric was not a man to accept defeat easily, and as their case against him grew stronger, his methods grew more desperate, more dangerous, threatening not just the estate's stability, but potentially the safety of everyone within it. Elena did not yet know how far Cedric might go to secure what he believed was rightfully his. But she knew, with growing certainty, that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them standing firmly beside Alastair, no longer as a stranger bound by obligation, but as a true partner, bound by choice and growing affection. As the snow continued falling outside the castle windows, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since her arrival, to imagine a future in this cold estate that might not remain cold forever. A future built not on the ashes of betrayal and pain, but on the fragile, hopeful foundation of trust slowly being rebuilt, one careful step at a time. The first sign that Lord Cedric intended to fight dirty came on a cold morning in late winter, when Alastair's most trusted steward, Edmund, arrived at the study looking pale and shaken. "Your Grace," Edmund said, his voice trembling slightly, "one of the tenant farmers from the northern border came to see me this morning. He says men have been asking questions in the village, offering money for anyone willing to speak against you, to claim you have mistreated the tenants or mismanaged the estate's affairs." Alastair's expression darkened immediately. "Cedric." "It would seem so, Your Grace. The farmer refused the money out of loyalty," he said, but he feared others might not be so resistant, especially with winter making things difficult for many families. Elena, who had been reviewing documents at the corner of the desk, looked up sharply. "He is trying to build a case of mismanagement against you, to strengthen his claim to the inheritance by painting you as an unfit duke." "It would seem so," Alastair repeated grimly. Elena's mind worked quickly, already considering how to counter this new threat. "We need to speak with the tenants directly, remind them of the improvements we have made this past year, the fair wages, the support during hardship. If Cedric is offering money for false testimony, we must ensure our own tenants remain loyal through honest means, through genuine care rather than bribery." Alastair nodded slowly, though worry still creased his features. "And if some do accept his offer regardless?" "Then we counter their claims with truth and evidence," Elena said firmly. "We have kept careful records these past months, Alastair. Every improvement, every fair contract, every instance of support offered to struggling families. If Cedric wishes to build his case on lies, we will bury those lies beneath undeniable facts." Over the following days, Elena and Alastair traveled together throughout the estate's lands, visiting tenant families personally, something Alastair admitted he had rarely done in recent years, having grown distant from the very people whose loyalty now proved so crucial. Elena watched him interact with these families, noticing his genuine, if awkward, efforts to connect with them, his sincere concern when he learned of hardships he had not previously been aware of. "You care for them," she observed quietly, as they rode back toward the castle after a long day of visits, "more than you allow yourself to show." Alastair was quiet for a moment before responding. "After Charlotte, after Edward, I convinced myself that caring for anyone beyond what was strictly necessary only invited pain. It was easier to maintain distance, to focus solely on numbers and contracts rather than the people behind them." "And now?" Elena asked gently. Alastair glanced toward her, something warm and genuine in his gray eyes. "Now I am beginning to remember that distance, while perhaps safer, is also lonelier than I had allowed myself to admit." Elena felt her heart warm at his words, recognizing the significance of such an admission from a man who had spent 5 years building walls specifically to avoid such vulnerability. Their efforts among the tenants proved largely successful. Most families, having witnessed firsthand the genuine improvements Elena and Alastair had implemented together, remained firmly loyal, refusing Cedric's bribes despite the temptation of easy money during difficult economic times. A few families, struggling more desperately than others, did accept his offers, providing exaggerated or entirely false testimony regarding supposed mistreatment. But Elena's careful documentation proved invaluable in countering these claims. When Cedric's petition finally reached formal review before the Crown's legal counsel, Elena and Alastair arrived prepared with overwhelming evidence, detailed records, and numerous genuine testimonials from tenants who spoke passionately of the positive changes implemented under Alastair's leadership, particularly since Elena's arrival. The formal hearing took place in the capital, a grand hall filled with nobility and legal officials, all eager to witness the resolution of what had become a rather scandalous dispute within noble circles. Elena stood beside Alastair throughout the proceedings, her presence a source of quiet strength as Cedric's lawyers presented their weak, poorly supported claims. When it came time for Alastair's defense, Elena watched with pride as he spoke clearly and confidently, presenting their carefully gathered evidence with a composure that surprised even her. Gone was the cold, distant duke who had greeted her arrival with such contempt months earlier. In his place stood a man who spoke passionately about his responsibility to his tenants, his commitment to the estate's future, his genuine partnership with the wife who had helped him rebuild what had nearly crumbled under years of neglect and pain. "My wife," Alastair said, his voice carrying clearly through the grand hall, "has shown me through her example what true leadership requires. Not distance and control, but genuine care and partnership. Whatever success this estate has achieved in recent months belongs as much to her efforts as to my own." Alina felt tears prick at her eyes, moved deeply by this public acknowledgement from a man who had once refused to even glance in her direction. She had not expected such recognition, had not sought it, but hearing him speak so openly of her contributions, before an audience of nobility who had likely expected nothing but cold formality between them, touched her more deeply than she could have anticipated. Lord Cedric's claims, weak from the beginning and further weakened by Alina's meticulous evidence, were ultimately dismissed by the Crown's legal counsel. Cedric himself, exposed as having attempted to bribe tenants into false testimony, faced significant embarrassment and legal consequences of his own, his reputation among the nobility severely damaged by his desperate and ultimately failed attempt to seize the Ravensworth inheritance. As they left the Grand Hall following the ruling, Alastair turned to Alina, relief and something deeper, something that looked remarkably like genuine affection, softening his usually guarded expression. "We did it," he said quietly, taking her hand in his without hesitation, a gesture that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. "We did," Alina agreed, squeezing his hand gently. "Together." As they traveled back toward the estate, the danger of Cedric's petition finally resolved, Alina found herself reflecting on how far they had come since that cold winter evening when she had first arrived at the castle, frightened and uncertain, married to a man who had seemed incapable of warmth or affection. The journey had not been easy, filled with challenges both external and deeply personal, but it had led them, slowly and carefully, towards something neither had expected to find within their arranged marriage. Genuine partnership, growing trust, and though neither had yet spoken the word aloud, something that increasingly felt very much like love. Yet even as this particular threat had been resolved, Alina sensed that their journey toward true happiness remained incomplete. Alastair still carried the deep scars of Charlotte's betrayal, scars that would not heal overnight simply because one external threat had been overcome. True healing, she understood, would require more than victory against Lord Cedric. It would require Alastair finally confronting the pain he had carried silently for 5 long years, allowing himself to fully trust again, not just in matters of estate management, but in matters of the heart. As their carriage rolled back through the familiar gates of the Ravensworth estate, now blanketed in the soft white beauty of late winter snow, Alina silently hoped that whatever challenges remained ahead, she and Alastair would continue facing them together, each step drawing them closer to the genuine, lasting happiness that both, in their own quiet ways, had begun to believe they deserved. Spring arrived slowly at the Ravensworth estate, melting the heavy snow into muddy fields and coaxing the first green shoots from the frozen earth. With Lord Cedric's threat behind them, a quiet peace settled over the household, though Alina noticed that Alastair, despite everything they had overcome together, still carried a certain guardedness whenever their conversations drifted too close to matters of the heart. She did not push him. She understood better than anyone that healing from betrayal as deep as his could not be rushed, no matter how much affection had grown between them. Instead, she continued as she always had, patient and steady, allowing their bond to deepen naturally through countless small moments rather than forced declarations. It was Margaret who finally spoke to Alina about the change she had witnessed in the Duke since her arrival. "I have served this family for over 20 years, Margaret said one afternoon, as they walked together through the newly blooming gardens. "I remember the young man Alastair was before his father's death, before Charlotte, before he became the person this household grew to fear. You have brought that young man back, my lady, piece by piece. It is remarkable to witness." Alina smiled softly, though a flicker of uncertainty remained in her heart. "I fear there is still healing left for him to find, Margaret. He cares for me, I believe, but he holds back from fully trusting that care, as if waiting for the pain of betrayal to return." Margaret nodded knowingly. "That fear may never fully disappear, my lady. But I have watched him this past year, watched the way his eyes soften when you enter a room, the way he seeks out your company even when matters of the estate do not require it. Whatever fear remains, I believe his heart has already decided to trust you, even if his mind has not yet fully accepted it. Elena carried these words with her over the following weeks, watching for the small signs Margaret had described, finding comfort in each one. She noticed how Alistair now sought her out during quiet evenings, not for business discussions but simply for her company, sharing stories of his childhood, memories of his father before illness had claimed him, moments of genuine vulnerability that would have been unimaginable months earlier. One evening, as they walked together through the gardens beneath a sky filled with stars, Alistair stopped suddenly, turning to face her with an expression she had never quite seen before, open and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. "Elena," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, one long overdue." "For what?" she asked gently. "For how I treated you upon your arrival, for the coldness, the contempt, the way I dismissed you entirely, blinded by my own pain and my own fear of trusting anyone again." He paused, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You did not deserve that treatment, Elena, not from the very beginning. And yet you never once wavered, never once retreated into bitterness despite how poorly I treated you." "I understood eventually why you built those walls," Elena said softly. "Understanding your pain made it easier to be patient with your coldness, even when it hurt." Alistair reached for her hand, holding it gently, his thumb tracing small, absent circles across her knuckles. "You have given me something I believed I had lost forever, Elena. Not just trust in matters of business or estate management, but trust in something far more personal. I find myself caring for you in ways I swore after Charlotte I would never allow myself to feel again." Elena's heart swelled with emotion, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "Alistair, he interrupted gently, "let me finish before my courage fails me entirely." He drew a steadying breath, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. "I do not simply care for you, Elena. I have fallen in love with you deeply and completely in a way I did not believe myself capable of feeling again after everything I suffered. You have shown me through your patience and your unwavering strength that trust and love are not weaknesses to be feared, but strengths to be cherished." Elena felt tears spill freely down her cheeks now, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his words, words she had hoped for but had not dared to fully expect so soon, given everything he had suffered. "I love you too, Alistair," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her own emotion. "I did not expect to, not when I first arrived, frightened and uncertain about this marriage neither of us had chosen. But watching you these past months, watching the man beneath the coldness slowly emerge, I fell in love with him completely." Alistair's expression broke then, into something Elena had never witnessed before, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, softening the sharp lines that had defined his features since her arrival. He reached up gently, cupping her face in his hands, his gray eyes filled with warmth and adoration that seemed impossible given the cold contempt he had greeted her with all those months ago. "Marry me again," he said suddenly, surprising her. Elena laughed softly through her tears. "We are already married, Alistair." "Not truly," he replied, his voice earnest. "That first marriage was built on obligation and duty, cold and distant, exactly as I intended it to be. I want to marry you again, properly this time, with genuine love and celebration, surrounded by those who care for us both. I want the entire estate, the entire nobility if necessary, to witness that this marriage has become something far greater than the arrangement it began as." Elena felt overwhelming happiness fill her heart, joy she had not believed possible when she first arrived at this cold, unwelcoming castle so many months earlier. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alistair, I would love nothing more." Alistair leaned forward then, gently pressing his lips to hers in their first genuine kiss since their forced wedding day, a kiss filled with all the love and warmth that had grown steadily between them despite the painful beginning of their union. Elena melted into the embrace, feeling for the first time since her arrival at Ravensworth Estate that she had truly found her place, not merely as a duchess bound by duty, but as a woman deeply and genuinely loved. As they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Alistair rested his forehead gently against hers, his voice soft with wonder. "I never believed I would feel this way again, Elena. Charlotte's betrayal convinced me that love only leads to pain, that trust only invites destruction. You have proven, through your patience and your strength, that I was wrong to believe such things forever." "Perhaps," Elena said softly, "some pain teaches us caution, but it should never teach us to abandon hope entirely. I am grateful, Alistair, that despite everything you suffered, you allowed yourself eventually to hope again." They remained together in the quiet garden long into the evening, sharing quiet words of affection, planning a future neither had believed possible when their journey together had first begun. The stars above seemed to shine brighter than Alina had ever noticed before, as if the universe itself celebrated the genuine love that had finally blossomed between two people who had once seemed destined only for cold obligation. Yet even amid this joy, Alina carried a quiet awareness that healing, true and complete, would require more than declarations of love alone. Alistair's relationship with his brother Edward remained fractured, unresolved, a wound that continued festering beneath the surface despite the healing they had found together. If Alistair was to fully reclaim the warmth and openness he had lost 5 years earlier, Alina suspected that healing would eventually require confronting that painful chapter as well, rather than continuing to avoid it entirely. But for tonight she allowed herself simply to enjoy this precious, hard-won happiness, trusting that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them together, bound now not merely by obligation but by genuine, deeply rooted love. Preparations for the second wedding ceremony began almost immediately, though this time the atmosphere throughout the castle felt entirely different from the cold, hurried arrangements of their first union. Servants moved through the halls with genuine excitement rather than fearful obligation, decorating the great hall with fresh spring flowers, preparing feasts that would honor not just tradition, but genuine celebration. Alina found herself swept up in the joyful preparations, though her thoughts often drifted toward Alistair's unresolved relationship with his brother. She had not forgotten Margaret's story, nor the way Alistair's expression darkened whenever Edward's name arose, even accidentally, in conversation. She understood that true healing for Alistair would remain incomplete as long as that particular wound stayed open and unaddressed. One evening, as they reviewed wedding preparations together in the study, Alina gently broached the subject she had been carefully avoiding for weeks. "Alistair," she said softly, setting aside the guest list they had been reviewing, "I wish to speak with you about Edward." Alistair's expression immediately shuttered old defenses rising instinctively at the mention of his brother's name. "There is nothing to discuss, Alina. Edward made his choice 5 years ago, and I have made mine in response. That chapter of my life is closed." "Is it truly closed?" Alina asked gently, "or simply buried beneath years of silence and pain?" Alistair's jaw tightened, though he did not immediately dismiss her question outright, a small sign of the growth he had achieved since their marriage began. "What would you have me do, Alina? Forgive him, forget the betrayal he and Charlotte inflicted upon me?" "I would not ask you to forget," Alina replied carefully, "nor would I ask you to forgive if you are not genuinely ready to do so. But I have watched you these past months, Alistair, watched you slowly release the walls you built around your own heart. I wonder if perhaps some part of you still carries pain regarding your brother specifically, separate from the pain of Charlotte's betrayal itself." Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, clearly wrestling with emotions he had avoided confronting for years. "Edward was my closest companion growing up," he finally admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "Our father was often distant, consumed by matters of the estate, but Edward and I were inseparable. When he chose Charlotte over our relationship, over our family, it felt like losing not just a fiancé, but my own brother entirely." "Have you heard from him at all these past 5 years?" Alina asked gently. Alistair shook his head. "He has written, occasionally, in the early months following their departure. I never responded. Eventually, the letters stopped arriving altogether." Alina considered this information carefully, an idea forming slowly in her mind, though she hesitated to voice it, uncertain how Alistair might react. "Would you be willing," she asked carefully, "to consider reaching out to him, not necessarily for reconciliation but simply for closure? I do not say this to cause you additional pain, Alistair, but because I have watched how deeply this unresolved wound continues affecting you, even now, even with everything else we have overcome together." Alistair remained silent for a long moment, clearly torn between old pain and the genuine healing he had experienced since Alina's arrival. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I do not know if I am ready for that, Alina. The wound Edward inflicted runs deeper than perhaps even Charlotte's betrayal itself." "Then we will wait," Alina said gently, "until you are ready, whenever that may be. I only wished for you to know that I am here, ready to support you through that healing whenever you decide to pursue it, just as I have supported you through everything else." Alistair reached for her hand, bringing it gently to his lips in a tender gesture that had become increasingly natural between them since their reconciliation. "Thank you, Alina, for understanding and for not pushing me faster than I am ready to go." Though Alistair did not immediately act on Alina's gentle suggestion, her words clearly lingered in his mind over the following weeks, as their wedding preparations continued alongside the ordinary business of managing the estate. Alina noticed him growing increasingly thoughtful during quiet moments, his gaze occasionally drifting toward old family portraits that included his brother, a silent acknowledgement of the pain he continued privately wrestling with. It was Margaret, once again, who provided a gentle nudge toward resolution, this time not through information shared with Alina, but through a quiet conversation with Alistair himself. "Your Grace," Margaret said one afternoon, finding Alistair alone in the study, staring absently at an old family portrait depicting himself and Edward as young boys, laughing together beside their father. "I have served this family for over 20 years. I remember well the bond you and your brother once shared before everything changed." Alistair did not respond immediately, though he did not dismiss her either, a sign of the growth Alina's influence had brought about within him. "I do not presume to know the full extent of the pain Edward's actions caused you," Margaret continued gently, "but I have also come to know Lady Alina well these past months, and I have witnessed the healing she has brought into this household, into your own heart specifically. I wonder, Your Grace, if perhaps that healing might extend even toward your brother, given time and genuine willingness on both sides." Alistair finally looked up, something conflicted but thoughtful in his grey eyes. "You believe I should reach out to him?" "I believe," Margaret said carefully, "that carrying pain silently for years without resolution rarely brings true peace. Whether reconciliation proves possible or not, perhaps speaking with him directly, hearing his own perspective after all this time, might offer you the closure you have been missing, even amid the genuine happiness you have found with Lady Alina." Alistair considered her words carefully, and though he said nothing further at that moment, Alina noticed, days later, a letter sealed and addressed in his careful handwriting, resting upon his desk, addressed to Edward Ravensworth. She said nothing, understanding instinctively that this decision needed to remain entirely his own, born from his own readiness rather than external pressure. But she felt quiet pride and hope watching him take this brave step toward genuine healing, a step that would have seemed impossible for the cold, guarded man she had first encountered upon her arrival at Ravensworth Estate. Weeks passed without response, and Alina watched Alistair carefully during this uncertain waiting period, offering quiet comfort whenever she noticed worry or old pain resurfacing in his expression. Their wedding preparations continued alongside this personal uncertainty, the household growing increasingly excited as the ceremony approached, unaware of the deeper emotional journey their Duke continued navigating privately. Finally, on a warm spring afternoon, a response arrived, delivered by a messenger who had traveled a considerable distance to reach the estate. Alistair received the letter with visibly trembling hands, retreating immediately to his study to read its contents in private. Alina waited anxiously throughout the afternoon, uncertain what news the letter might contain, hoping desperately that whatever Edward had written might bring Alistair the closure and healing he so deeply deserved after years of unresolved pain. When Alistair finally emerged from his study as evening approached, his expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions, grief and relief intertwined in a way Alina had never witnessed before. She approached him carefully, offering silent support without pushing him to share more than he was ready to reveal. "He apologized," Alistair said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Genuinely deeply, for the pain he caused, for the cowardly way he and Charlotte handled their departure all those years ago. He explained that guilt over betraying our relationship has haunted him every day since, that he has longed for reconciliation but feared I would never forgive him." "How do you feel?" Alina asked gently. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "Uncertain," he admitted honestly. "Part of me still carries anger toward him, toward the pain his choices caused. But another part of me, a part I believed I had lost entirely, longs for the relationship we once shared as brothers before everything fell apart." "Perhaps," Alina suggested gently, "healing does not require choosing between those feelings entirely. Perhaps you can hold both the lingering pain and the genuine hope for reconciliation simultaneously, allowing time and continued communication to determine where that balance eventually settles. Alistair looked at her with genuine gratitude, reaching for her hand once again. "You continue teaching me things I did not believe myself capable of learning, Elena: patience, hope, the courage to remain vulnerable despite past pain." "We are teaching each other," Elena replied softly. "I have learned as much from your strength and resilience as you claim to have learned from me." As their wedding day approached, Alistair began a careful, gradual correspondence with Edward, neither rushing toward full reconciliation nor closing the door entirely on the possibility of eventually rebuilding their fractured relationship. Elena watched this healing process unfold with quiet pride, understanding that true strength often lies not in maintaining rigid walls of protection, but in the courage required to remain open to healing, even after devastating betrayal. Whatever the future held for Alistair's relationship with his brother, Elena felt confident that the foundation of genuine love and partnership they had built together would continue supporting him through whatever challenges and healing remained ahead, just as it had carried them both through everything they had already overcome since her arrival at Ravensworth estate all those months ago. The morning of the second wedding arrived bright and warm, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Ravensworth Castle in a way that felt entirely different from the grey, somber morning of their first ceremony months earlier. Elena stood before the mirror in her chambers, dressed in a beautiful gown of pale gold silk, her hair arranged with delicate spring flowers woven throughout, and hardly recognized the confident, radiant woman staring back at her. Margaret, who had become far more than simply a helpful servant over the past months, a genuine friend and confidant, fastened the final buttons along Elena's back with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "You look truly beautiful, my lady," Margaret said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I have served this family many years through much sorrow and difficulty. It brings my heart great joy to witness such genuine happiness returning to this household." "Thank you, Margaret," Elena replied warmly, turning to embrace the older woman gently. "For everything you have done, not just for me, but for helping guide Alistair back toward the man he was always meant to be." Downstairs, the great hall had been transformed entirely from the cold, sparse space of their first wedding into a celebration filled with warmth and genuine joy. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance filling the air. Long tables prepared for the wedding feast stretched throughout the hall, and unlike their first ceremony, this ceremony would be attended not by a handful of reluctant witnesses, but by tenants, servants, and nobility alike, all genuinely invited to celebrate the union that had blossomed from cold obligation into true, deeply rooted love. As Elena made her way toward the chapel, accompanied by her own parents who had traveled considerable distance to witness this joyful occasion, she felt her heart swell with happiness and gratitude for how dramatically her circumstances had transformed since that frightened carriage ride so many months earlier. Alistair waited for her at the altar, dressed in formal attire that could not entirely contain the genuine warmth radiating from his expression as he watched her approach. Gone entirely was the cold, distant man who had barely acknowledged her presence during their first ceremony. In his place stood a man whose gray eyes shone with unmistakable love and adoration, watching her every step with an intensity that made her heart race with joy. As she reached the altar, Alistair reached for her hands, holding them gently within his own, his thumbs tracing soft, affectionate circles across her knuckles as the priest began the ceremony. This time, when they exchanged their vows, Alistair's voice carried genuine emotion, each word spoken with deep sincerity rather than the hurried, obligatory tone of their first ceremony months earlier. "Elena," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly evident in his gray eyes, "when you first arrived at this estate, I greeted you with coldness and contempt, blinded by pain I had carried for years. I did not deserve the patience and strength you showed me during those difficult early months, yet you gave them freely without complaint, until slowly, carefully, you helped me rediscover a part of myself I believed had been lost forever. I love you deeply and completely, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the extraordinary woman who transformed not just this estate, but my own heart, through her unwavering strength and genuine kindness." Tears streamed freely down Elena's cheeks as she listened to his heartfelt words, moved beyond measure by the transformation this remarkable man had undergone since their difficult beginning. When it came time for her own vows, she spoke with equal sincerity, her voice steady despite the emotion filling her heart. "Alistair, when I first arrived here, frightened and uncertain about a marriage neither of us had chosen. I could not have imagined the journey that awaited us. I have watched you overcome pain that would have broken lesser men, watched you slowly rebuild trust and warmth you believed lost forever. I am honored beyond words to be the woman who witnessed that transformation, and I promise to continue standing beside you, through whatever challenges and joys the future holds, as your partner, your equal, and your wife, bound now not by obligation, but by genuine, unwavering love. As they exchanged rings for the second time, this ceremony carrying none of the coldness of their first union, the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife once again, and this time Alistair did not simply turn and walk away as he had done before. Instead, he gathered Alina gently into his arms, kissing her tenderly before the joyful gathering of witnesses, sealing their renewed union with genuine, heartfelt affection that brought tears and applause from everyone gathered within the chapel. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music, laughter, and genuine joy throughout the entire estate. Tenants who had once feared even glancing toward the cold duke now approached freely, offering warm congratulations and genuine well wishes for the couple who had brought such positive transformation to their community. Servants who had once moved through silent, fearful hallways now danced and celebrated openly, grateful witnesses to the remarkable healing that had unfolded within their household over the past year. Amid the celebration, Alina noticed a figure standing somewhat apart from the joyful crowd, watching the festivities with an expression of cautious hope. She recognized him immediately from the family portraits she had seen throughout the castle, and her heart swelled with emotion as she realized Edward Ravensworth had traveled to witness his brother's wedding, despite the uncertain state of their relationship. She gently nudged Alistair, drawing his attention toward his brother's presence. Alistair went very still, his expression complicated as he registered Edward's unexpected arrival. For a long moment, neither brother moved, the weight of 5 years of separation and pain hanging heavily between them. Then slowly, Alistair began walking toward his brother, Alina following close behind, offering silent support through this difficult, significant moment. Edward watched his brother's approach with visible nervousness, clearly uncertain how he would be received. "I did not expect you to come," Alistair said finally, his voice carrying complicated emotion. "I could not stay away," Edward replied, his voice equally uncertain. "Despite everything, despite the pain I caused you, I could not miss witnessing your happiness, even if you decide never to fully forgive me." Alistair was quiet for a long moment, studying his brother's face, clearly searching for something within his expression. Finally, he extended his hand, a gesture of tentative, cautious reconciliation. "Thank you for coming, Edward," he said softly. "Perhaps, in time, we might find our way back toward the relationship we once shared. I cannot promise complete forgiveness today, but I am willing finally to try." Edward's eyes filled with tears as he grasped his brother's hand firmly, gratitude and relief evident throughout his entire expression. "That is more than I dared hope for, Alistair. Thank you." Alina watched this reconciliation unfold with quiet joy, understanding the significant courage required for both brothers to take this tentative step toward healing old wounds. She knew their relationship would require considerable time and patience to fully rebuild, but the foundation for that healing had finally been established, on this joyful day that already represented so much positive transformation for everyone involved. As the celebration continued late into the night, Alina found herself standing beside Alistair, watching their guests dance and celebrate throughout the beautifully decorated hall. Alistair wrapped his arm gently around her waist, drawing her close, his expression filled with genuine contentment and happiness. "I never believed I would feel this way again," he said softly, echoing words he had spoken to her weeks earlier in the garden. "Genuine happiness, genuine hope for the future. You have given me back everything Charlotte and Edward's betrayal took from me, Alina, and so much more besides." "We gave it back to each other," Alina replied gently, resting her head against his shoulder. "This journey required both of us, Alistair. Your willingness to slowly open your heart again, and my patience in waiting for that healing to unfold naturally." Alistair pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his voice warm with genuine love. "Whatever challenges the future holds, I know now that I do not face them alone. I have you beside me, Alina, and that knowledge gives me strength I did not believe myself capable of possessing again." As their wedding celebration continued joyfully around them, Elena allowed herself finally to fully embrace the happiness she had found within this remarkable, unexpected journey. She had arrived at Ravensworth Estate months earlier as a frightened stranger, bound to a cold, distant man through nothing more than cruel obligation. She now stood as his true wife, his genuine partner, having witnessed and contributed to his remarkable transformation from cruelty and isolation toward warmth, love, and renewed hope. Their story, born from forced obligation and cold contempt, had ultimately blossomed into something neither had believed possible when their difficult journey first began: genuine love, deep partnership, and a future filled with hope, healing, and happiness that both had once believed entirely lost to them forever. A year passed at Ravensworth Estate, and the transformation that had begun with Elena's frightened arrival now stood complete throughout every corner of the household. The cold, silent hallways that once echoed only with fearful footsteps now carried the warm sounds of laughter, purposeful activity, and genuine community. Tenants who had once trembled at the mention of their duke now greeted him openly in the village square, grateful for a leader who finally understood and valued their well-being. Edward visited more frequently as the months passed, the relationship between the two brothers healing gradually, built upon patient conversation and genuine effort from both sides. Charlotte remained a subject neither brother discussed directly, though Alastair had, with quiet grace, released the bitterness he once carried toward her, understanding finally that dwelling on old pain served no purpose beyond preventing his own happiness. Edward, for his part, remained deeply grateful for the second chance his brother had extended, working diligently to rebuild the trust his earlier choices had shattered. Lord Cedric, having suffered significant embarrassment and financial consequence following his failed petition, retreated entirely from noble society, his attempts at causing further trouble effectively silenced by his damaged reputation. Elena occasionally wondered what had become of him, though she felt no particular need to seek out that information, content instead to focus entirely on the genuine happiness that continued flourishing within her own life. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted gently across the castle courtyard, Elena found Alastair in his study, reviewing estate documents with the same careful attention he had always brought to his responsibilities, though his expression now carried none of the cold severity that had once defined him. "I have news," Elena said softly, entering the room with a small, nervous smile playing at her lips. Alastair looked up immediately, setting aside his papers, giving her his complete attention in a way that had become entirely natural between them over the past year. "What is it, my love?" Elena crossed the room slowly, taking his hands gently within her own. "We are going to have a child, Alastair." For a moment Alastair simply stared at her, stunned silence filling the study as her words settled fully within his understanding. Then slowly an expression of pure, unrestrained joy spread across his features, transforming his face entirely as he rose from his chair and gathered her gently into his arms. "A child," he repeated softly, wonder evident throughout his voice. "Our child." "Yes," Elena confirmed, laughing softly through unexpected tears of happiness. "By spring, if the physician's calculations prove correct." Alastair pressed a tender kiss to her forehead, then to her lips, his entire body trembling slightly with overwhelming emotion. "I did not believe such happiness remained possible for me, Elena. Not after everything I endured. Not after the years I spent convinced that warmth and family were luxuries destined to remain forever beyond my reach." "You deserve this happiness, Alastair," Elena said softly, resting her hand gently against his cheek. "You have worked so hard to heal, to open your heart again despite everything you suffered. This child will be fortunate indeed to have such a father." News of Elena's pregnancy spread quickly throughout the estate, met with genuine celebration from servants and tenants alike, all of whom had witnessed firsthand the remarkable transformation their duke had undergone since Elena's arrival. Margaret, upon hearing the news, embraced Elena warmly, tears of genuine joy streaming down her weathered cheeks. "This household has needed new life for far too long," Margaret said softly. "A child born from such genuine love, within a family finally healed from years of pain and isolation. It is more than I ever dared hope to witness during my remaining years of service." As the months progressed, Elena watched Alastair prepare for fatherhood with the same careful, thoughtful attention he brought to every important matter in his life. He read extensively about child-rearing, consulted with the estate's physician regarding preparations for the birth, and began, with genuine enthusiasm, preparing a nursery within the castle that would soon welcome their child into the world. Edward, upon learning of his brother's impending fatherhood, wrote immediately with heartfelt congratulations, expressing genuine hope that he might eventually build a relationship with his future niece or nephew, an opportunity that would have seemed impossible given the fractured state of the brothers' relationship merely a year earlier. Winter arrived once again at Ravensworth Estate, though this winter carried none of the cold isolation that had defined Elena's first months within these walls. Instead, the castle buzzed with warm anticipation, preparations for the impending birth mixing joyfully with the usual celebrations of the season. On a cold February morning, nearly identical in weather to the day Elena had first arrived at the estate over a year earlier, their daughter entered the world, her arrival marked not by cold obligation, but by overwhelming joy and celebration throughout the entire household. Alastair held his newborn daughter for the first time with hands that trembled with emotion, tears streaming freely down his cheeks as he gazed upon her tiny features. "She is perfect," he whispered softly, his voice thick with overwhelming love. "Absolutely perfect." Elena, exhausted but radiant following the birth, watched her husband cradle their daughter with a tenderness that would have seemed impossible from the cold, distant man who had barely acknowledged her presence during their first meeting over a year earlier. "What shall we name her?" Elena asked softly. Alastair considered the question carefully, his gaze never leaving his daughter's peaceful, sleeping face. "Hope," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet certainty, "because that is precisely what she represents, what you brought back into my life when I believed such things were lost to me forever." Elena felt fresh tears gather in her eyes at his choice, understanding completely the significance behind such a name. "Hope Ravensworth," she said softly, testing the name aloud. "It suits her perfectly." As their daughter grew throughout the following months, Ravensworth Estate continued flourishing, its transformation from a place of cold isolation into a genuine, loving home now complete. Alastair proved himself a devoted, gentle father, spending considerable time with young Hope despite his continued responsibilities managing the estate, determined that his daughter would never experience the emotional distance that had characterized much of his own childhood following his father's untimely death. Edward visited frequently throughout Hope's early months, gradually building a genuine relationship with his niece, and through that connection, continuing to heal the relationship with his brother that had once seemed permanently broken. The brothers, while never quite recapturing the uncomplicated closeness of their childhood, found a new, mature understanding between them, built upon genuine forgiveness and mutual respect for the growth each had achieved. Elena, watching her small family flourish within walls that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming, often found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. She thought of that frightened young woman who had arrived at Ravensworth Estate over a year earlier, uncertain and afraid of the cold, distant duke she had been forced to marry. She thought of the patience and strength that journey had required, the careful, gradual healing that had transformed cruelty and isolation into genuine warmth and love. She understood now with complete certainty that some of life's most profound happiness emerges not from circumstances chosen freely, but from the courage to remain true to oneself even amid difficult, unwanted situations. She had not chosen this marriage, had not chosen the cold contempt that greeted her arrival, yet through patience, genuine kindness, and unwavering strength, she had helped transform that painful beginning into a life filled with deep, genuine love. Alastair, for his part, often expressed quiet gratitude for the woman whose strength and patience had guided him back from years of isolation, and pain toward the warmth and happiness he now experienced daily within his own home. He no longer carried the cold contempt that had defined his early interactions with Elena, replaced entirely by deep, genuine devotion toward his wife and their growing family. As Hope's first birthday approached, marking a full year since her joyful arrival into their lives, Elena and Alastair stood together in the castle gardens, now blooming beautifully with the same spring flowers that had witnessed their second, genuine wedding ceremony years earlier. Hope toddled unsteadily between them, laughing joyfully as she explored the colorful blossoms surrounding her. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Elena asked softly, watching their daughter with genuine contentment. "If I had simply accepted your initial coldness, if I had retreated into fear rather than standing firm against it?" Alastair considered the question thoughtfully, reaching for her hand as they watched their daughter play. "I believe," he said finally, that I would have remained forever trapped within the cold isolation I had built around myself, convinced that love and trust were dangers to be avoided rather than gifts to be treasured. You saved me from that fate, Alina, through nothing more than your genuine strength and unwavering kindness. We saved each other, Alina replied gently, echoing words she had spoken to him during darker, more uncertain days of their journey together. This happiness belongs to both of us equally, Alistair, built through patience, courage, and genuine love that neither of us expected to find within a marriage that began as nothing more than cold obligation. As the sun began setting gently over Ravensworth estate, casting warm golden light across the blooming gardens where their small family now stood together, Alina felt overwhelming gratitude for the remarkable journey that had led her to this precise moment of genuine, hard-won happiness. The cruel Duke who had once despised the very idea of their forced marriage had transformed entirely, through patience, healing, and genuine love, into a devoted husband and father, his cold heart finally, completely warmed by the woman brave enough to stand firm against his cruelty until she changed his heart forever. Their story, born from pain and obligation, had ultimately become a testament to the transformative power of genuine kindness, patience, and unwavering love, a reminder that even the coldest hearts can find their way back toward warmth, given time, understanding, and someone brave enough to believe in the possibility of change.